As humans, trust is a complex emotion which can often take years to build. It is also an important factor in business, which can impact on everything from speed of innovation to even the perceived wealth of an entire nation. Today on LokadTV, we're delighted to be joined by Sheri Hinish, a supply chain thought leader who has also been affectionately known as the supply chain queen. Today, we're going to get her views on this idea of trust and how we can build it in our networks. So Sheri, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Perhaps as a sort of a first start off, you could just sort of tell us a little bit more about yourself and a bit about your background.
Sure. So I believe that supply chains have the power to change the world. And I've made a career advocating, sharing, and rethinking supply chain strategy around S&op and talent management, helping executives and professionals reimagine their approach to supply chain through the lens of technology, sustainability, and leadership. Right now, my work focuses mainly on strategy and providing a point of view on emerging trends, including social media with purpose. And I'm also a huge advocate for women in STEAM. So I'm super excited to join you guys. I've been following you on YouTube for a while now. And I'm currently in my last year at Harvard. I have about 15 years of formal education in the supply chain sustainability domain, but I have promised my husband that this will be my last degree.
And also, we've got to ask, perhaps you could just sort of tell us a little bit about the story behind the name, the Supply Chain Queen. Where did that kind of come from?
Sure. So it actually started out as a nickname when I was in industry. And I was named the Supply Chain Queen for two reasons. The first was I had the ability to simplify the complex and then also be a bridge not only for workforce generations, but sitting in a room full of PhDs where everyone has it figured out and being able to really get people to mobilize and work together through common purpose in mega transformations. Then nice. I trademarked it.
Well, the idea of simplifying the complex is something we definitely try and do here on LokadTV. It's a bit of a challenge sometimes. Joannès, our topic today is all about building trust. What's your initial overview on this concept of trust, particularly in supply chains?
My overview is that trust is something that is typically, I think, misrepresented by medias and whatnot, you know. For example, people would represent, business relationships as, something very formal with a lot of contracts involved, a lot of lawyers, and people shaking hands, etc. And the reality is something much more messy and mundane, where mostly things just happen. It's very funny. Trust is not something that you see, that you don't touch. It's not obvious. It's kind of ambient. And actually, the funny thing is that you usually don't see trust, but you can notice, and it's become very obvious when there is distrust in the air. It's when there is tension, and so it's more like the opposite becomes very bold and visible. And there you say, okay, we have a trust issue. And so first, it's something that is quite counterintuitive, I would say, in popular representations. And the funny thing is that I've noticed in supply chains is that, probably out of good intent, many people tend to have, I would say, bad reflex in these areas. And so they don't necessarily do intuitively things that are going to actually positively contribute to, I would say, the degree of ambient trust, I would say.
Okay. And when we kind of look at these most successful companies kind of in the world, like the Apples and the Microsofts of this world, fundamentally we trust them. You don't know the last time it was you probably read the terms and conditions in a Microsoft update. But Sheri, how have these companies managed to build that level of trust? What have they done?
Yeah, so if I could go back to my earlier comment about simplifying the complex, it's simple. Don't do anything that generates distrust. It's that simple. But in all seriousness, the reality is that trust is complex because humans are complex. And when we think about trust, it's often associated with feelings as much as demonstrated ability of being trustworthy through action. So I think that there are a few things that contribute to distrust in supply chains and in value networks. Resistance to change, fear, situational power, reliance and risk. All of these things come into play in system dynamics and influences when we think about our interactions with suppliers and with clients. I think that the most successful people focus on transparency and delivering what they say they will. So trust isn't necessarily the goal. It's more an outcome after you deliver your promises.
Okay. Yeah, I think, Joannès, we're all very human, and sort of that idea of losing trust can happen kind of in a matter of moments. I mean, what have you observed that leads to this kind of inherent distrust?
I mean, there are a lot of things that are, for example, many of the things where, it can be slightly counterintuitive is that there are simple things that are like literally engines to generate distrust. For example, penalties, you can be very rational and saying, okay, we are going to apply penalties to our suppliers when they don't hit nominal performance. So, okay, it looks very rational, we are going to reward the good guys, we are going to punish the bad guys, so we are going to have like, to establish stock out penalties on our suppliers. Okay, and the second you do that, you're going to make yourself an enemy of the supplier where the first time you try to apply a penalty in the real life and you want some money back from your supplier because they didn't deliver on time. So I would say it starts at the first dollar. It doesn't even have to be a large amount. The first time, by the minute you try to collect, a stock out penalty from a supplier, you're going to enter a whole realm of egos, and so it's like a recipe for I would say, an ongoing generation of problems. Same things with, for example, when you give, financial incentives to people to do certain class of things. For example, when you give financial incentives to buyers to get the lowest price, they will get the lowest price, yes, but maybe they will get also insane MOQs in the process. And thus, you end up with a very messy situation where you just put the blame on purchasing, who did something very bad, such as negotiating super high MOQs because they had this incentive, and then people lose trust in the ability of the buying team to actually do the right thing because they had this kind of pseudo-rational incentive in place. So I would say it's funny because I would say distrust frequently emerge from naive attempts at, I would say, superficial rationalism, or pseudo-rationalism.
Okay. And Sheri, if we kind of look at things now from probably a supply chain perspective, I mean, when we look at the supply chain industry, particularly in the modern day, there's lots of different networks. They're all interacting with each other in a very kind of particular way. What have you observed from how these networks kind of work together?
Yeah, I think I would echo what was just said, and that, networks in general as a whole can be inoperable also, and they're not cooperative by design. And then when you add this flavor of digitalization and the acceleration of technology, coupled with the nature of trading relationships inside and outside four walls, it gets highly ambiguous. I can provide examples from my own career. When I was in specialty chemicals, suppliers were also competitors, and customers were also competitors in tolling agreements, for example. There are other examples that we can use from Fresh, where a supermarket's private label often competes against more well-known products on the shelf, who often have a hand in the production of a brand's own items. So I think that we really need global standards. And it's not just around networks, but how might we collaborate more effectively, not to bring in game theory or, classic prisoner's dilemma here, but we need to defect less. And we need to be more cooperative and understand the power of that cooperation, not only in the world we share, how we interact, industrial systems, technological systems, and natural systems, but also how we react with each other in our own organization, with trading partners, and in networks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting kind of example you kind of had there between this difference between sort of competitors and suppliers. I mean, that's one we've kind of experienced here in the aerospace industry, is you've got some of the big airlines are actually working together to share their spare parts. I mean, does this introduce a level of ambiguity, Joannès?
I mean, that's interesting because you see, cooperation is very rewarding. I mean, to a point where, you know, usually things are, when you heavily cooperate with competitors, it works better. I mean, it works so much better that there is even a term for it when you're completely like this with your competitor. It's called a cartel. And then you end up with an ambiguous situations where, yes, absolutely, a cartel to work, you need a very high degree of trust in between, you know, those organizations. But then you end up with another problem, which you get usually by doing that, you end up with a large amount of distrust from the rest of the world, which suddenly looks at you and say, you guys, you're cooperating so closely that I'm not sure that you're actually acting in the global interest of the rest of the world. But it's difficult because, matter of fact, cooperation works, you know, a lot. And for example, those airlines, it's about, for example, when you have a missing spare part for an aircraft, it can cause an AOG problem, aircraft on ground. And airlines are cooperating enormously with each other to kind of solve this problem, to minimize the problems for passengers, because actually when a passenger gets a massive delay at an airport, they just remember that you know, airlines are sometimes a real pain, and that you can end up with a 2 days delay for a flight. So basically it's a net loss almost for the entire industry, not just for one airline.
Let's stick with that supply chain theme and maybe explore the relationship that users have with some of the tools that they're actually using. From your experience, would you say that the supply chain practitioners actually trust the tools and the softwares they're currently using?
I think that people in general, they have shiny object fatigue. And many folks are happier using Excel. And Excel works for some organizations where they have control and they feel a higher degree of confidence in a high-touch environment. And I think that the root cause is that there's distrust from having disparate IT systems and data silos. I remember in my career as a demand planner, I was surrounded by data. There was no shortage. I had piles of canned reports on my desk, but what I needed most were insights. And the reality is, Excel in the future of work, it's only going to get you so far, because it just can't simply pull in tons of data and externalities to form those causal relationships that you really need. What happens outside of your four walls of your company? And to get those deeper insights, you really have to transition more toward using the tools, using, I hate using this phrase digital supply chain because I think it's overused. But that transformation is necessary, and it includes just as much technology advances in AI and ML as it does mobilizing a new workforce, a new way of working. So more modern approaches, they require people to trust in algorithms without fully understanding how they work, and it's difficult. I can share an example around even something like a Google search. We typically rely on machine learning when we type in a phrase and we scroll through maybe top 5 to 10 recommendations. How often do people really scroll past page 2, page 3? So I think that there's a bridge and that we can learn to trust, but I think that it really is going to take connecting the why at the individual level and then cascading that across your organization, your supply chains, your trading partners. So like you mentioned before, people understand the value in relying on technology, that it's an enabler, and that cooperation really provides that speed to value that's needed in today's modern business world.
Yeah, and this is kind of a topic we've touched upon so many times before, is this idea of, do the practitioners fully understand the tools they're using? I mean, it's difficult, right?
Yes, it's difficult, and unfortunately, I would say the track record of enterprise software has been quite poor for the last couple of decades, in the sense that my casual observation is that when I look at, you know, the applicative landscape of, you know, any fairly large companies, you know, any fairly large company, let's say, you know, $500 million and above, usually when you look at the applicative landscape, it's a mountain of accidental complexity. So it's complexity that is not even close to reflecting the actual complexity of the business. It reflects things that are completely irrelevant to them. I mean, it can be, I would say, old architectural software decision made by the vendor decades ago for reasons that have been long gone, but it's still at the core of the software for whatever reason. It might be because the software is actually serving a large, diverse set of industries, so they end up with plenty of options and whatever that are just completely irrelevant to their specific case. So it's like overbroad, it's called bloatware, you know, overbroad software that can do everything, but it's way too much for this specific needs. And thus, when you put, I would say, this kind of applicative landscape, and you look at the track record decade after decade, it doesn't necessarily seems to go in a direction where no matter how good the technology can be, it will actually converge to something that is super practical and useful, just because there is not necessarily, I would say, an active process to clean up and get rid of this accidental complexity. That tend to be, I would say, systems that are strictly additive. Every layer comes on top of the previous one, and you end up with, you know, many, many layers systems where the older the company, the more ancient the company, the more, you know, layers there is around, and it's only keep growing forever.
Yeah. We're going to start wrapping things up a little bit now. Final sort of question. We're in a very worldwide economy. You've got multinational corporations that have got silos across nations, different departments, and we're talking about networks of huge scale. Is it very difficult to build trust across all of these networks and build those lines of communication?
Yeah, I think it is difficult. That this is the elephant in the room. It's in my point of view, just through the lens of organizational leadership and change management, it's hard to build trust without inclusive leadership and a culture that really embraces learning, embraces failure, curiosity. And the organization has to take time to truly understand those trade-offs and the management of change. You know, I was a practitioner. I was a demand planner. I, you know, accelerated through the ranks in my career. And I think when you feel like you're just a cog in a machine, or an exception alert, or an override, it can be demoralizing. I've consulted organizations who have been wildly successful in building networks at scale, but I've also seen it fail miserably. And I think that most people just never get over that hump of change. The key ingredient, though, is taking time to create space for that transformation, making sure that you're ready and recognizing that change is continuous. It isn't something that you just come in on a Monday morning, you go live, and we have a digital transformation. We're transformed, right? It doesn't work like that. Technology is a tool. It's an enabler. And you have to make an environment where individuals, all through an organization, all through a value network, they understand that this sort of advancement is tied to their effectiveness in their jobs and delighting the customer, because that's why we're all in business. So the analogy that I use in my engagements is when you think about planting a flower, you have to make sure that the soil is ripe. Okay, you can't just go in, drop the seed, Every now and again, you just water the soil and you hope that the flower blooms. It's much more complicated than that. And if we think about that analogy, there's parallels to digital transformation. You have to make sure that the soil is ripe, that the roots are intact, before you expect a pretty flower in 2 weeks, 2 years, 2 decades. So really focus on the soil, focus on making sure that you're creating the right environment before you implement a tool that just gets you there even faster when you're automating bad process and bad behaviors.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it there, but thanks for your time. So that's everything for this week. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye for now.